On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle, and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, welcome to Brazier Fast-Paced News from 4 until 6. Coming up on today's show, the mother of baby P is cleared for release by the parole board. We'll attempt to establish why. Also, can Prince Harry really be about to miss his grandmother's platinum jubilee because of an alternative engagement, namely a polo tournament in California? Also, what happens to employees who refuse to go along with unconscious bias courses? Toby Young of the Free Speech Union has details of one potentially shocking case. And why has the Heard defamation trial seen millions of fans sign a petition demanding that she be dropped from appearing in a Hollywood blockbuster? Plus, the reason there are fewer insects splatting on car windshields in Britain this year, and the flight, if not of the Bumblebee, then of the all-electric plane in Norfolk. And tomorrow, GB News, live coverage of the local elections from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We'll be analysing the results with election experts, top politicians, and discussing what the results mean for you too. Alongside me throughout today's show, we've got the commentator, Cathy Gingle, but first we have the headlines for you with Polly.
Colin, thank you. The top story today, the Bank of England has raised its key interest rate to 1%. That's from 0.75%. It's the fourth rise in a row and the highest base rate since early 2009. The Monetary Policy Committee's trying to calm inflation, which it forecasts will peak at over 10% this year. The bank has also warned the economy is set to shrink next year by 0.25%. Matt Dromfield is head of Debt Free London. He says inquiries have soared 250% since this time last year.
Many people think that you go into debt because you've splurged on a credit card or you've overspent on the weekend and not realise it. That's really not the situation whatsoever. Debt doesn't discriminate. We're all facing a cost of living crisis, with the cost of your mortgage maybe going up later today, depending on the Bank of England's announcement, your rent going up, your food going up. All these are essential costs that you can't control, and you're left with nothing at the end of the month.
Meanwhile, there are renewed calls for the government to impose a windfall tax on energy companies after the oil giant Shell reported a big increase in profits. The company revealed record first quarter earnings of £7.2 billion, triple the amount it made in the same quarter last year. It joins the rival BP in posting better than expected profits for the first 3 months of 2022. Surging oil and gas prices have helped offset the cost of boycotting Russian supplies. But equity analyst Keith Bowman doesn't think it'll have an effect on energy bills.
From where we stand, I don't think any great change is expected in the near future. There is the possibility, we never know, of some sort of resolution as far as the Ukraine conflict is concerned. But even if that were to happen, I think it would take some time for the relationship between the West and Russia to thaw.
Well, in other news today, the mother of baby P is to be released from prison. Tracy Connolly could be freed within weeks after the parole board rejected a government challenge to keep her behind bars for longer. Connolly was convicted in 2009 for causing or allowing the death of her 17-month-old son. Justice Secretary Dominic Raab described Connolly as pure evil and said the justice system needed a fundamental overhaul. Polling stations are open today across the UK as millions of voters take part in local elections. The Prime Minister took his dog Dylan with him as he cast his vote this morning. And the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, also voted alongside his wife. And the Liberal Democrat's Ed Davey visited his local polling station too. In fact, voters all over Britain are choosing their local representatives in England, Scotland and Wales, and there's also an election for the Northern Ireland Assembly. In news from Ukraine, the governor of the eastern city of Luhansk says 5 civilians have been killed in shelling in the last 24 hours. A further 25 are reported to have been hurt in a Russian missile strike in Kramatorsk in Donetsk. The city's mayor says a school and kindergarten were damaged in the attack. Meanwhile, a Ukrainian presidential advisor says there's renewed fighting at the Azovstal plant in Mariupol. President Zelensky is urging its allies to help rebuild the country.
The rebuilding of Ukraine now should be the same historic example for our time and future as the rebuilding of European countries after the Second World War was in its time. And such investments by the free world, if they are quick, if they are sufficient, will mean that millions of our people who became forced migrants because of this war will be able to return home.
Japan and the UK have agreed a landmark defence deal as the two countries address ways to put pressure on Russia. During a meeting in London today, Boris Johnson and Fumio Kishida have said the pact will allow forces to deploy together to carry out joint exercises as well as humanitarian disaster relief. Japan also announced a wave of new sanctions against the Kremlin. It's Mr. Kishida's first official visit to the UK, and it was marked with an RAF flypast. And Buckingham Palace says Her Majesty the Queen will miss the annual Royal Garden Party season. The monarch will instead be represented by other members of the royal family. Her Majesty has mobility issues and has missed a number of engagements this year, but she continues to carry out virtual appearances and other duties instead. You're with GB News, more news as it happens. Now it's back to Brazier.
We'll bring you more on the baby P news and also interest rates today, what that means for the cost of living crisis very shortly. But first this, the first duty of government is the protection of life, not its destruction. Abandon that and you've abandoned all. These are the words that were accorded to Thomas Jefferson, author of the US Declaration of Independence. Boris Johnson likes to think of himself as a man of history, and maybe he ought to heed those words, despite the outbreak of the first major ground war in Europe in decades. The Institute for Fiscal Studies estimated in March that the UK's day-to-day defence budget could fall by 3% a year in real terms for the rest of this Parliament. Let's turn to the Chair of Parliament's Defence Committee, who is calling for the government to, quote, wake up, and is launching a new campaign this week to push defence spending from 2% of GDP to 3%, and that is Tobias Elwood, who joins me now. Tobias Elwood, thanks for your time. Is 3% enough?
Well, it's heading in the right direction. I think what I'm trying to convince people is that we've turned a corner in our history. What's happening in Ukraine isn't just going to stay in Ukraine, but actually it's going to have huge consequences, both from a kinetic, from a military perspective, but also in our way of life. And we do need to spend more on defense as we see Russia and China increasingly exert themselves with greater confidence and challenge our way of life. Our international rules-based order that has served us well for about 40 or 50 years looks very, very wobbly indeed. And I'd go even further, without sounding too dramatic, that there's a 1938 feel to where we are today. And we need to be prepared for what is coming over the hill. Our Army, our Air Force, and our Navy actually were cut in their capabilities in the last review that took place a year ago. I would like to see those cuts reversed and us be ready to have the hard power for what's coming over the horizon.
My guest in the studio yesterday was former Defence Secretary Michael Portillo, and we talked at some length about spending on defence, but in particular about where you get the money from. I suggested you could look at, for instance, and you can only do it once, I suppose, looking at foreign aid. We currently send, for instance, £250 million a year to Pakistan, currently, which is lining up with Russia more than it is with us right now, so we could question some of those spending decisions. But long term, where is the money going to come from? Would you borrow to invest in defence? Where's it coming from?
Well, it isn't for me to spell out where that money comes from. That's for the Treasury to understand the consequences of us not spending money on defence. What happens to our economy, our prosperity, if we don't look after our international interests, because it would be affected as it is now. The fact that we're not leaning into Ukraine enough to close down this war is having a direct effect on the cost of living because of food prices going up, oil and gas prices are going up. There's a global consequence here, and it's rippling right through to what's happening here in the UK. If we resolve and help Ukraine resolve the problems there, that will affect our local economy here, but we're not doing that. And you touched on DFID, international aid spending. You know, that's a really interesting one because many of these places that are now insecure are places that we've walked away from. Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Afghanistan. You know, we have given up because we didn't have the strategic patience. My bigger concern is that the world as a whole is getting more dangerous, not less. And there needs greater international leadership. And there's a gap in the market for that, for Britain to step forward, as we've done in the past, to shore up our international support, our allies, and step forward. Because, as I say, authoritarianism is on the rise across the world, and that's what's coming over the horizon in the next few months and indeed years.
Coming over the horizon, armed with nuclear weapons, Liz Truss, Foreign Secretary, says this could be a conflict that takes 10 years to resolve. Do we really have the strategic patience? Does the Chancellor of the Exchequer, do our coffers have the money in them to last for a decade?
Yeah, I mean, really good point. I don't think we have the strategic patience to allow this to last for a decade, and we can't allow it to. If we need to ask ourselves, what is success in Ukraine? What is the goal that we're pouring all these weapon systems in for? All NATO countries must lean in and have a strategic outcome that we're aiming for. To my mind, that must be removing Russia from mainland Ukraine. And that will affect the consequence of Putin being able to sell this to his own people. If we are able to show that Putin has failed, there's more chance that the Kremlin, that the Russian people will remove him himself. If there's any form that this could be sold as a success, then he will actually go beyond Ukraine. He'll look at Moldova, Georgia, potentially Bosnia, potentially also even into the Baltics itself. And that, again, means that more kinetic problems, more military insecurity, more requirement for us to spend on defence itself, and, of course, more problems for our own economy.
Tobias Ellwood is chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee. Tobias, thanks very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. Cathy Gingle is with us in the studio today for the next, the next 2 hours or thereabouts. Liam Halligan's come in to talk about interest rates, but you're very welcome to throw your 2 pence into this one as well, because defence spending's expensive, isn't it?
Back in the 50s, defence spending was about 8% of GDP and NHS spending was 3% of GDP. They're completely reversed over the last 70 years. The money will have to come from somewhere. I do think there's a head of steam, though, building up, particularly in the States and the UK. It'll be interesting to see, won't it? And echoes here of Donald Trump's time when he was trying to shame some of the EU nations into hitting that NATO 2% of GDP spending target on defence. It'll be interesting to see as and when, and I think it is as and when, the US and the UK increase defence spending, if those EU nations follow.
Cathy, do you think there's a generational aspect to this? I just wonder whether... I mean, Liam and I are about the same age.
Steady.
People, I think anybody under 40...
You're saying I'm so much older. Thank you.
That's why I said steady. That's why I said steady.
I just got there.
Serious topic. Anybody under 45 didn't grow up, as Liam and I probably did, with those, genuine anxieties about the mushroom cloud nuclear Armageddon, all the rest of it. The Cold War, the staples of the Cold War. And I just wonder how much of a bearing you think that has on this story.
Well, I think we've lost sight of the idea that all countries need some boots on the ground. I mean, the defence spending ratio percentage is interesting. I recently met the chief advisor to the head of the French army, a PR lady. They have 250,000 in their army. I think we have 85,000 in our army. I think we only have about 30,000 combat-ready troops. So, in a way, it was about Tobias Ellwood is sort of, you know, singing in the wind, really. We've so long given up the idea of having an armed force in our country that meets our country's population and requirements, whether it's for floods. The army is always required to do things, but it seems to me the heads of defence staff have, up until now, up until the wake-up call of Ukraine, thought we could run a digital war with drones, with them sitting in their armchairs pressing computers. Well, the reality is you never can. If you want to have a nation and you want to protect your nation, you must have an armed force, regardless of whether there's a war going on somewhere else or not.
OK, let's tell you why Liam Halligan's actually here. The Bank of England has just raised its...
To protect Cathy from you.
Thank you, what a gent.
The Bank of England, yes, come back. The Bank of England has just raised its base rate from 0.75 to 1% in a bid to tackle soaring inflation. It's the highest it's been for 13 years. Liam, you were sort of suggesting that these figures were in view a while ago. 6 weeks ago, you were saying that...
When I launched on the money in September, I was saying that inflation was a big deal. It was going to hit double digits. The Bank of England's now acknowledged that inflation, CPI inflation, Consumer Price Index, headline rate of inflation will be 10% or more by the end of this year. And if that is the case, Colin, that's the highest rate of inflation since 1982, talking about the Cold War. So it's a very difficult situation we're in because the Bank of England now belatedly is raising interest rates to bear down on inflation, to try and slow down spending by consumers and firms at a time when the economy is slowing anyway, at a time when the conundrum is made a lot more complex by this war in Ukraine, which has put rocket boosters on both fuel and food prices. So I'm not saying it's easy, it's very, very difficult, but we do now face the very real danger, it gives me no pleasure at all to say it, that the Bank of England, to rein in inflation and convince the world that we're not just going to lots more inflation, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, workers push for higher wages, firms put prices up because they think their inputs are going to become more expensive. We face the very real possibility that in pushing down on inflation, the bank could actually tip the economy into recession when you have a successive quarters of economic shrinkage.
And is this inflation price realistic? I mean, the producer price inflation...
20%.
30%, I read in an economic report today.
The latest... You're right. We're both right. The latest official number for PPI, Producer Price Index, is 19.2% in March, OK?
Yeah.
You're exactly right, Cathy. Characteristically, industry surveys, preliminary inflation numbers of 30% producer price inflation, particularly in the agricultural sector.
Yeah,
Colin, it's fertiliser, fuel and finance. The three Fs, excuse my French.
We have a farmer on every week.
Of farming. You've been covering it on your show. I've been covering it on my show. I think GBNews has done very well on this story. And those three Fs are all a lot more expensive for farmers. And three expensive Fs for farmers means the final F, food, is more expensive for all of us.
We're just doing a story there about the importance. What is the most important thing that the nation-state does? Keeps its people safe. Second most important thing, keep them fed. Food security. Liam, for now, thanks very much indeed. Coming up, the man who was sacked for questioning the idea of white privilege in his own home. First, got a break.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle, and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Here's my angle today. Are you old enough to remember a time when work involved a fairly simple transaction? You gave up your time and labour in exchange for a company's cash. Provided you did your job reasonably well, hit targets, met standards, pleased customers, then all was well. There were clear lines of demarcation. The firm was in the business of making money, you were in the business of making a living. But then something happened. Companies started to think it was okay to tell employees not just what they could earn, but what they should think. You may have experienced this shift yourself. Unless you work for yourself or for a small family business, you will have noticed perhaps how modern corporations now insist on a role in the moral formation of their employees, a role once reserved for spiritual or political leaders. One manifestation of this urge to shape the character of staff is the unconscious bias course. Perhaps you've attended one. I did a couple of years ago, and I have to say it was pretty much the final nail in the coffin of my 24-year-long association with Sky TV. My employer got off on the wrong foot straight away. You see, language matters, doesn't it? And when, along with everyone else, I was invited to participate in a course that was described as compulsory, my hackles went vertical. An invitation, by definition, can be declined. How do you refuse a compulsory course where attendance is mandatory? Well, to my shame, I agreed to that invitation without a bat squeak of dissent. And worse still, at the end of the online session on Microsoft Teams, when the moderator asked if anyone had any questions, I sat on my hands, which was cowardly and supine, because I did have a question. I'd found the presenter's thesis that as a white man I was guilty of seeing the world oblivious to my own prejudices utterly unconvincing. It was snake oil and pseudoscience dressed up as Holy Writ. Any questions? Of course I had a question. How much are you charging for this twaddle? Is what I should have said, what I wanted to say. The words formed in my throat, but that's where they stayed. Perhaps you've had a similar experience. Maybe you attempted to critique an unconscious bias course, but thought better of it, having a mortgage to pay or a promotion in mind, perhaps. Maybe you just kept your gob shut and shared your true feelings with an intimate later on. That's what Simon Isherwood thought he was doing in March last year. The 60-year-old had also just finished an unconscious bias course on Teams. He, like me, thought it was meretricious guff and told his wife so. Unfortunately, he did so without turning his computer microphone off. His colleagues, some of them seemingly heard everything. As the Daily Telegraph reported today, there were complaints, and after a disciplinary, Simon was out on his ear, even though his 11 years at the company had hitherto been exemplary. What did he say that was so offensive? Apparently, he wasn't complimentary about the course and dared to wonder whether there was such a thing as black as well as white privilege. Specifically, and because he has a friend from West Africa, he wondered whether there was such a thing as black privilege in Ghana. If that's all that was said, it sounds incredibly innocuous. But in the looking-glass world of unconscious bias, the mere act of questioning its legitimacy is a kind of shop-floor heresy and career suicide. Now, there may be another side to this story. Mr. Isherwood has taken his dismissal to an employment tribunal scheduled to wrap up tomorrow. And his employers aren't saying anything on the record until the process is completed. According to the Telegraph, West Midlands Trains denies the allegations and argues that Mr. Isherwood's remarks were offensively expressed. But I think this case, if it is as described, raises important questions about the nature of the modern workplace, about the willingness of companies and the HR executives within them to play a role once reserved, frankly, for the priesthood, to tell us how we should relate to the world around us, what our original sins look like. These companies have no democratic mandate for the ideologies they foist on employees who feel rightly chilled into silence. They have no right to interfere in areas that are a matter for individual conscience. This corporate overreach has to stop, and the people who should stop it are those we've chosen, through elections, to codify our behaviour. It's time MPs told big businesses they have no right to be our moral guardians. That's the Brazier angle. The General Secretary of the Free Speech Union is Toby Young, who joins me now. Toby Young, welcome to you. Is my description of this case that the Free Speech Union's brought to this employment tribunal a fair one?
Yes, I think it is. So the Free Speech Union is backing Simon. He's a member of the Free Speech Union, and we found him a lawyer in the form of Paul Diamond, a very experienced civil rights lawyer. And the case is being argued before a panel at the Employment Tribunal as we speak, Colin. And we're expecting a judgment to be handed down tomorrow. And we're very hopeful that it'll go our way.
I don't want to say any more about that individual case for obvious legal reasons, Toby. You may feel more confident to do that, but there are certainly general principles we can turn over, aren't there? And I think the most obvious one is the one I tried to address in my quite personal monologue there, about how individuals relate to their employers on this one and the sense in which they feel cowed.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, Colin. I think that in many workplaces, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector as well, employees are now expected to undergo numerous forms of diversity training, including anti-racism training, unconscious bias training, and so on and so forth. And this is, as you hinted at, a huge multi-billion pound industry. In the US a few years ago, I remember checking this, and the diversity training business in the US was worth $8 billion a year. And that was a few years ago. It's almost certainly doubled, perhaps even tripled in size since then. And the UK is not far behind. And the evidence that it actually works, that it actually creates more equitable workplaces in which people of colour, women, homosexuals, transgendered people feel more comfortable, feel more at home, feel less discriminated against. There's very, very little evidence of that at all. On the contrary, there is some evidence. The government's behavioural science unit actually did some investigating because so many Whitehall departments are insisting on all kinds of diversity training for their employees. So the behavioural science unit, when it was still part of the Cabinet Office last year, investigated just how effective. They investigated the evidence base underpinning these courses. And not only did they conclude that there was no evidence at all that they actually reduced prejudice and discrimination in the workplace, they actually said that in some cases it can increase it. You know, workplaces become racialized environments when white employees are told that they're privileged and that they're responsible for the transatlantic slave trade and all kinds of injustices dating back to the Middle Ages. That can racialize a workplace, that can divide a workplace, far from actually creating a more harmonious, less divided workplace. It has the opposite effect. So the Behavioural Science Unit and the government recommended that all this training be dropped. And of course, it costs the taxpayer hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. I don't think it has been dropped in every case, but it's not quite as ubiquitous as it was across Whitehall. But by God, it's absolutely rampant across the public sector and indeed in the private sector now.
Do you think there ever was, Toby, a sort of golden age when employers, when it was just an entirely transactional, seamless relationship between an employer giving up their labour, an employee giving up their labour, an employer paying somebody so to do? I mean, I can think back to city of my birth, Bradford, where there's a beautiful complex set up by a village, Salt's Village, set up by the eponymous Mr. Salt, a patrician who, as well as building beautiful houses for people who were working in his mills, insisted on things like going to Sunday school. So this idea that actually companies haven't got involved in the spiritual guidance or the character formation of employees might not be entirely accurate. My big beef with this is the total lack of any democratic accountability that actually, and I think back to my previous employer, when they issued an inclusive language guide urging people not to use words like, mother or father, if they'd actually submitted that to everybody who worked in that place, the Nigerian security guards and the Polish cleaners, etc., rather than just the highly networked people who talk to each other at the top, they'd have got a different answer from the one they wanted.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, where are the trade unions in all this? This is a workers' rights issue. So many people coming to the Free Speech Union for help are ordinary people, like this chap who's in the Employment Tribunal today, doing not particularly glamorous jobs, who've said something that some of their colleagues, some of their woke colleagues have objected to, and they've suddenly found themselves under investigation and in some cases, as in this case, dismissed for gross misconduct. Not for saying anything unlawful, but for apparently saying something which is a breach of the company policies which now police what their employees can and can't say. And the really sinister thing, Colin, is that often when you look at these policies, when you look at a company's social media policy, for instance, it doesn't just police what the employees can say in the workplace during office hours. It polices what they can say outside office hours, outside the workplace. It's like there's no limit in the company's eyes to the remit on how much of an employee's speech it can police. So we had one case last year, a special constable. He had said something to his boyfriend in a two-way WhatsApp chat between them, entirely outside working hours. It was a conversation between two people who were romantically involved, and he used the word pikeys, which is a pejorative racial epithet, according to the police code of conduct. And when he broke up with his boyfriend complained about him. He was investigated and he was dismissed for gross misconduct. And that was for saying something in a two-way WhatsApp, an entirely private WhatsApp conversation with his other half. So if companies now think they can police that kind of speech, where's the limit? There's no limit to this. And we hope that by fighting some of these cases in the Employment Tribunal, if necessary, appealing them to the Employment Appeals Tribunal, we can help draw a line and say to companies, no, you can't overreach, you can't police what your employees say outside of the workplace, outside office hours, and your attempts to police what they do say inside office hours has gone completely over the top.
Toby Young, we'll talk to you about the result as and when we get it, I hope. But for now, thanks very much indeed. Cathy Kingill is alongside me. I ought to stress that the company involved here is obviously making the case that they feel they've done nothing wrong. Yeah. But we'll see when the judgment comes through from that employment tribunal. The broader point about this relationship between employed and employer, is it changing?
It began actually a long time ago. I remember in the early days of TVAM when I was working there, the first things came up about sort of female harassment, about sort of all the women's identity issues, which I'm sure, and victimhood issues, which in a funny way I rebelled against, because I felt if you were treated badly in the workplace, you just followed the normal procedures. You didn't have to identify it as an identity issue. And also, I think it took away people's power to be able to turn to you and say, hey, you've told me I'm old. That's not very nice. How about improving your manners, mate? This seems to me to be the more honest response. And so you're making people worse by taking away from them their responsibility to behave in a sort of moral, decent, compassionate, do as you would be done by way, and put it onto a workplace with rules that see all actions through the lens of prejudice. And that is nihilistic and nasty and Stasi-like.
Well, you put it very well, Cathy. Thanks very much indeed. More from Cathy Gingell later on. We've got the headlines and a break coming up.
Colin, thank you. The headlines. The Bank of England has raised interest rates for the fourth time in a row from 0.75% to 1%. That's the highest level since 2009. The Monetary Policy Committee is trying to calm inflation, which it forecasts will peak at over 10% this year. The banks also warn the economy is set to shrink next year by 0.25%. The mother of baby P could be released from prison within weeks after the parole board rejected a government challenge to keep her in jail for longer. Tracy Connolly was convicted in 2009 for causing or allowing the death of her 17-month-old son. The Justice Secretary Dominic Raab described Connolly as pure evil and said the justice system needs a fundamental overhaul. The Prime Minister took his dog Dylan with him as he cast his vote for the local elections this morning. The Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer also voted alongside his wife, and the Lib Dems' Ed Davey was seen visiting his local polling station too. Voters are choosing local representatives in England, Scotland and Wales, and there's also an election for the Northern Ireland Assembly. Ukraine's Prime Minister says his country has received over £9.5 billion worth of weapons and financial aid since Russia's invasion. That, as President Zelensky has asked the UN to help ensure the safe passage of more than 200 civilians from the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol. A presidential advisor says there's renewed fighting at the steelworks in the besieged port city. Those are your headlines on TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. More from Brazier in just a moment.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, as we were just discussing, an employment tribunal is happening today, tomorrow, brought, we're told, by a man who allegedly lost his job for criticising a workplace course on unconscious bias. He apparently wondered that if white privilege existed, then might black privilege do so too in a country like Ghana? Well, his comments weren't meant to be shared. He reportedly left his computer microphone on, but on the face of it, they hardly seem to warrant dismissal, if that's what happened. Joining us now, the retired judge and chair of the Society of Black Lawyers, that's Peter Herbert, as well as the author and charity worker Nick Buckley. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Appreciate your time. Our question is diversity training indoctrination? Peter Herbert, what do you say?
Well, no, it depends on how it's done. I mean, you're not going to indoctrinate people if the training is appropriate, like equality training or training on financial management. Or how to broadcast. You know, anything can be indoctrination if it's done improperly. But generally speaking, it is done by professional people, and you will get people who are good at it, and you'll get people who are good. But it's an important part of our society, as with anything else.
Nick Buckley, it's all just training, and there are good trainers and bad trainers.
There is good trainers, there is bad trainers. But the courses themselves are not needed, they're a waste of time, and they're divisive. And for me, the ones I've seen, it's a form of brainwashing. You know, we have a different elite now saying to people, we're going to tell you how you act and what you think and what you believe. And if you don't, there'll be consequences. And I'm just not for it at all.
Peter Herbert, there is obviously, it seems to me, a distinction between, say, being trained how to do a TV interview and being trained to spot the signs of white privilege. One, I would submit, reaches into areas of individual conscience. One is tendentious, one isn't. For me, what's striking and what struck me before is the fact that you're invited on these courses. An invitation suggests you can decline. You can't, not really.
Well, it depends on your employer. I mean, there are also people who refuse to be trained. I took part in training of full and part-time judges in the 90s, and there were about 5% of judges who just would not receive any training. And you will get in an employment situation people who do not wish to move from their own, often quite prejudicial views of the world, and whether that be xenophobic or racist or basically gender bias, that you, in a sense, are faced with a difficulty. I don't know this individual, and it is for the tribunal at some point to determine where the truth lies. But you will have, as my colleague there, you will have people who think it's all a waste of time anyway. I mean, there are dinosaurs all over the place, and they have to be confronted at times and dealt with. But they have to
well, let's put that to said dinosaur. Nick Buckley, you're a dinosaur and you need to be confronted.
That's exactly the point I'm trying to make. We have self-proclaimed elite that will say, only my view is the right view. Only I know what is right for you, what is right for society, the right for everybody else. It's my view because I'm better than you. I need to send you on training so you think a little bit more like me. It never crosses any of their minds that they may be wrong. It never crosses any of their mind that they may be right, but also other people may be right. We talk about diversity, and this is a cliche now, but we never talk about diversity of thought. Just because someone doesn't agree with me doesn't mean I'm right, that doesn't mean I'm wrong. The more different types of thought and different ideas we have, the better society will be. But diversity of thought is the only diversity we do not want in this country.
Peter Herbert, what do you say to those people who say, OK, I mean, Peter suggested that there were lawyers he's worked with who declined the opportunity to go on a course, but they were probably quite well established in their careers. They'd been well paid up until then. That's not the experience of the vast majority of people who are lower down the employment food chain and who feel perhaps that if they decline the opportunity to go on one of these courses, they prejudice their future career prospects.
Well, I was talking about judges, actually, not lawyers. And it doesn't matter where you are on the food chain, you have a duty to act within the law. And therefore, in a sense, there may be many people, I jokingly call it a dinosaur view, but actually who would practice unlawfully and discriminate quite visibly against their colleagues. That is unacceptable. What they think inside their own mind is perfectly acceptable, but let it stay there. And it is what is called a balancing of rights. So no, it's wrong for people to insist that there cannot be a diversity of views. Of course there can be, but the diversity of views must end when it causes unlawful offence or harm to others. And therefore, all of us act as you do as a broadcaster. You will not tolerate people who are abusive or swear on air. Those are rules. That's not diversity of thought. There are some people who would love to swear on air, but they don't, because your broadcasting standards don't allow it. So all of us have a right to respect the values, the norms, and the sensitivities of others.
Nick Buckley, can we just address the democratic principles that may or may not be at stake here? It certainly seems to me, and I'll express a personal opinion as I already have on this, that there is a problem, there is a democratic deficit when it comes to some of these areas. I'm thinking of things like inclusive language guides, but it can also be the imposition, I use that word carefully, of unconscious bias courses. That the people who decide what those courses ought to contain, or an inclusive language guide ought to contain, if they actually put that to the test, the democratic test, and so we are talking about something very profound here, how people think, then actually, and that democratic test was put to all the employees rather than just a small cabal who work in corporate affairs or HR, then the answer they'd get might not be the one they wanted.
Absolutely. And that's probably why they'll never do it. Now, Peter's right. If we're looking at the law, then businesses, individuals, we need to enforce the law. And if we don't like the law, then we need to change it. We don't break it, we change it. Now, running alongside the laws, we have social norms. And social norms are unwritten rules a society develops over time that nearly all of us sort of agree with, and we go along because we know it's for the greater good. And some of the things that were wrong 50 years ago, homosexuality was illegal and was looked down upon, through the changing of social norms have become acceptable. Now you can get married if you're gay. So if we want to change some of these things that diversity training is saying they want to change, then it's the law or it's the slow chipping away at social norms, because everybody needs to agree with these things in society. Because what's happening now, because we're being dictated to, we're beginning to fracture, we're splitting into groups, and there's going to be a backlash if we don't stop this, and if we don't start coming together and all following the same rules and all following the way that we all want to live in this country.
Well, Peter Herbert, that was the point made a few moments ago by Toby Young, the General Secretary of the Free Speech Union, who said that actually, in his view, and he pointed to some evidence to this effect, that sometimes unconscious bias courses can actually have the counterproductive effect of racialising people who hitherto hadn't really given it a lot of thought. It can backfire.
I'm not sure quite what world they're living in, but, you either have those views or you don't. People don't just go on an unbiased, anti-bias course or racist course and suddenly become racist or xenophobic or sexist. No, that's a nonsense. You either are you or you're not. And therefore the backlash is, if you're a thinking, knowing, rather reason being, you have a choice. You have a choice whether to keep your thoughts to yourself. You know they may cause offence, and keep them to yourself. If it about that willing to respect difference of others. And that's all, in a sense, diversity is. You respect the right of women to be who they are, people who are gay to be who they are, and people who disagree with your views to be who they are. And yes, if you stop them vocalising that is simply to stop them breaking the law or causing offence, which is unnecessary, harmful, and really can't, in a sense, once those words or conduct are uttered, be put back, as you would having the Prime Minister having a COVID lockdown party. I mean, we have those norms. One of the things, you might break the law, but you broke the social norm of what was acceptable or unacceptable.
But this is, I think we come to the nub of it there. Nick Buckley, codifying social norms. Peter Herbert mentioned doing, say, training in media training. I can tell you objectively what a terrible interview looks like. Let's hope it's not this one. You look at the camera, there are certain bits of TV grammar you obey, and that's objectively true. It seems to me, and I've sat through an unconscious bias course dealing with race, and I found it pretty meretricious. I thought it was psychobabble, and I thought it was subjectively bogus. And that's very different from, say, teaching something about how you do, make sure you look at the camera, sit straight, don't fidget, which is objectively true. These are very different things. Nick Buckley.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go back to my original statement. This is a type of brainwashing. And as Peter said, we obey the law, but then there's also don't say things that may be harmful. Well, who judges harm? It goes back to the same thing again. Keep your mouth shut. If you're not going to say what we want you to say or what we agree with, you better be quiet. And it's constant all the time of lots of these different organisations that are promoting this sort of ideology. And it always is the same lesson. Agree with us or shut up. And it's not this training is just about that. And people sit there, I know people have been on this training, and they sit there, they're fuming inside, but are too scared to say anything because of what happened to this train driver. They're absolutely fuming.
Well, allegedly to this train driver. Gentlemen, thanks for keeping that sensible and civil. Nick Buckley, Peter Herbert, thanks very much indeed. Cathy Gingell is alongside me today to reflect on this.
It is very authoritarian, and I think Nick got it at the end as the resentment, and it came out in your marvellous monologue on this. The resentment is huge, and you think, why are you resentful? Because I would find it insulting if somebody said they thought I needed to go on a diversity training course. I think I look at mankind and people... I don't think I have to have my brain cleared of my decent education, my decent Christian and moral education that I've had all my life in order to talk to somebody properly because of their ethnicity or skin colour or sex or gender.
So Cathy, why don't more... Well, I think I know the answer to this question before I put it. But why don't more people walk? Why don't more people say...
Oh, I think people are scared, and I think this is why everyone's so angry about lockdown. Everybody obeyed it. People are now programmed into not thinking critically and not being contrarian. I've said it before on this programme, I'm a contrarian, but people find it very scary to say their different views out loud. And the other thing is you cannot prejudge people breaking the law. What did the gentleman mean exactly? That you have to train people in your company so they won't break the law by saying something that somebody else might find offensive. Actually, where is the law? I mean, they're hate crimes, I suppose it is, partly now. But it's an astonishingly... It takes away all our human agency to be decent human beings. Instead, we have to live and work by arbitrary rules, and that cannot be good for... That's not an enlightened position.
Cathy Gingell, thanks very much indeed. After the break, men with beer bellies, who are we talking about, are at greater risk of dying from prostate cancer. Is it time to put down the pints? Time for the weather.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. It's turned into a fine spring day for southern parts of the UK, but cloudier skies have plagued the north and there'll be outbreaks of rain, increasingly so overnight and into the start of Friday. These weather fronts are toppling in over an area of high pressure. They've been lurking close to the northwest of Scotland through the day, hence the cloudier and, in places, damp weather. But increasingly they'll spill south overnight, so for western Scotland by midnight, spells of rain, heavy and persistent at times, and then during the early hours that rain pushing into Northern Ireland and much of the rest of Scotland. Increasingly cloudy too for northern and western England as well as Wales, some mistiness around coasts, but clear spells holding on in central and eastern parts of the country. A few fog patches possible first thing, temperatures down to around 8 degrees in London. But bright enough as we start off Friday. We'll keep the sunny spells for East Anglia and the southeast throughout the day. Brightening up as well following a damp start for Scotland and Northern Ireland. 1 or 2 showers following, a fresher breeze for the far northwest, but otherwise plenty of fine weather to end the day. But in between, northern England, North Wales sees the rain arriving during the morning and sticking around for much of the afternoon. Eventually, the rain does push south during Friday night, but it really fragments, and so it's not going to be of great use, I don't think, to gardeners and farmers. Only light outbreaks by the end of the night and the start of the weekend. Soon enough, it does clear. And then for Saturday, we start with quite chilly air in places for Northern Ireland, for Northern England and Scotland, but actually much of the country gets off to a fine start. Plenty of sunny spells. There'll be some mistiness around western and southern coasts. However, inland, plenty of sunshine. I'm feeling warm in that sunshine. Temperatures up into the low 20s in the south, mid to high teens further north. Sunday's looking similar, plenty of fine weather.
I'm Liam Halligan. Join me every weekday at 1 p.m. for On the Money, your daily dose of economics, business and consumer news. I've got 25 years experience covering economics and finance. We hold grown-up discussions with a host of experts who really know their stuff. We can't buy gas and store it. That was a mistake, wasn't it?
I think it was a mistake.
Even you, Liam, don't have a crystal ball.
Inflation's a real threat.
Every weekday at 1, you're On the Money.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Now, men with beer bellies are at greater risk of dying from prostate cancer, researchers found, apparently for the first time. A study by the University of Oxford finding that for men who are overweight, nearly every extra 4 inches around the waistline increases the chance of early mortality by 7%. As always, these figures can look incredibly precise, but we get the gist, don't we? The research found that cutting the average male body mass index by 5 points, in old money, that's about 2.5 stone, for a typical man could save 1,300 lives a year. Let's turn to an NHS GP, Dr. Amos Ogunkoya, who joins us now. Amos, welcome to you. I mean, we know, don't we, and we have this developing sense in recent years that a band of fat around the tummy, around the waist, is no good thing.
Yeah, it's not new information. I think what this study has shown is that they've collected a lot of information and it's proved what we as clinicians have already kind of known. And I think common sense knows that having a bit of a belly isn't really good for your health.
What's the connection specifically with prostate cancer, which as we remember, as we've been told in recent years, is, I was going to call it the silent killer of so many men. It's not so silent anymore, is it? We do know about it, but the numbers are huge.
Yeah, this is huge. I mean, this is something that's personally very important to me because my granddad died of prostate cancer. And we know that certain ethnic groups and people with family histories are more likely to get it. It's not the silent killer anymore because people are talking about it. The connection to prostate cancer is new, but we kind of suspected that already because we know that cancer, overall cancer for anyone who has excess fat increases. What we're realizing now is that fat isn't just a storage. We know it's active and it's constantly producing inflammation, and that increases your risk of cancer. And
you get very often the sort of pot belly of cartoon depiction. I mean, often on men who are who aren't otherwise obese or fat, but they've got the pot belly. I mean, are they as much risk as people, as larger men?
Yes. In fact, we realise now, and that's the real change in information, that it's not about the peripheral fat, it's the central fat. We call it central obesity. And that is the most important. The fat that's around the organs is the one that's the most, we call it metabolic active. What that means is that it affects the whole of your body, the fat around your abdomen.
Do they call it visceral fat, Amos? Is that
Yeah, viscera means organ. Yeah.
So it's as you say, and the inflammation's interesting as well, because that's not something we associate with what's happening inside our bodies. Inflammation's never a good thing, is it?
Exactly, it isn't. In this context, it's what increases the risk. Like I said, we used to think that fat was just a storage unit. It was harmless. But now we know that it produces hormones, it produces inflammation, and that's the real risk moving forward. And I mean, you mentioned that cutting out the beer, but I mean, I don't want to be the bringer of bad news, but anything in moderation and losing weight is always the best way for patients who are carrying a little bit more around the midriff.
We were just talking in the studio about whether COVID has made this worse. I mean, the presumption would be it has, and it's always interesting, this spot where we talk to an NHS GP about what's coming through your doors. Is obesity a bigger problem than it was 2 years ago? And is there a connection, you think, with COVID?
I think the awareness of obesity has gone up. I think people were aware since COVID that they've been less active. I'm seeing more of it, but 7 out of 10 people in the UK are overweight, and that's BMI. But really and truly, we're missing a lot of the people who you mentioned before, who are slim but are carrying a lot of weight around the abdomen. And there's the ones that need to be targeted for this report. And we can improve their health. 1,300 deaths of men can be prevented by reducing that.
Amos, really good to talk to you. Really appreciate it. Difficult subject for some of us, but well worth tackling. Thanks a lot. It's 5 o'clock. Welcome to Brazier, fast-paced news from 4 until 6. Coming up today, the mother of baby P is cleared for release by the parole board. We'll attempt to establish why. Also, can Prince Harry really be about to miss his grandmother's platinum jubilee because of an alternative engagement, namely a polo tournament in California? And why has Amber Heard, the defamation trial there, seen millions of fans sign a petition demanding that she be dropped from appearing in a Hollywood blockbuster? Plus, the reason there are fewer insects splatting on car windshields in Britain this year, and the flight, not of the Bumblebee, but of the all-electric plane. A reminder too, on GB News tomorrow, live coverage of the local elections from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We'll be analysing the results with you and discussing what they mean for you. And alongside me throughout today's show, the commentator Cathy Gingell. But first we have the headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. The top stories today. The Bank of England has raised its key interest rate to 1% from 0.75%. It's the fourth rise in a row and the highest the base rate has been since early 2009. The Monetary Policy Committee is trying to calm inflation, which it forecasts will peak at over 10% this year. The banks also warn the economy is set to shrink next year by 0.25%. Matt Drumfield is head of Debt Free London. He says inquiries have soared 250% since this time last year.
Many people think that you go into debt because you've splurged on a credit card or you've overspent on the weekend and not realise it. That's really not the situation whatsoever. Debt doesn't discriminate. We're all facing a cost of living crisis, with the cost of your mortgage maybe going up later today, depending on the Bank of England's announcement, your rent going up, your food going up. All these are essential costs that you can't control, and you're left with nothing at the end of the month.
Well, there are renewed calls for the government to impose a windfall tax on energy companies after the oil giant Shell reported a big increase in profits. The company revealed record first quarter earnings of £7.2 billion, triple the amount it made in the same quarter last year during the pandemic. It joins rival BP in posting better than expected profits for the first 3 months of 2022. Surging oil and gas prices have helped offset the cost of boycotting Russian supplies, but equity analyst Keith Bowman doesn't think it's going to have an effect on energy bills.
From where we stand, I don't think any great change is expected in the near future. There is the possibility, we never know, of some sort of resolution as far as the Ukraine conflict is concerned. But even if that were to happen, I think it would take some time for the relationship between the West and Russia to thaw.
Well, in other news today, the mother of baby P is to be released from prison. Tracy Connolly could be freed within weeks after the parole board rejected a government challenge to keep her in jail for longer. Connolly was convicted in 2009 for causing or allowing the death of her 17-month-old son. Justice Secretary Dominic Raab described Connolly as pure evil and said the justice system needed an overhaul. Polling stations are open across the UK today as millions of voters take part in local elections. The Prime Minister took his dog Dylan with him as he cast his vote this morning. And the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, also voted alongside his wife. And the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, visited his local polling station too. Well, voters all over Britain are choosing local representatives in England, Scotland and Wales. And there's also an election for the Northern Ireland Assembly. In news away from home in Ukraine, the governor of the eastern city of Luhansk says 5 civilians have been killed in shelling in the last 24 hours. A further 25 are reported to have been hurt in a Russian missile strike in Kramatorsk in Donetsk in the east of the country. The city's mayor there says a school and a kindergarten were damaged in that attack. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian presidential advisor says there's renewed fighting at the Azovstal plant in Mariupol. President Zelensky is urging its allies to help rebuild his country.
The rebuilding of Ukraine now should be the same historic example for our time and future as the rebuilding of European countries after the Second World War was in its time. And such investments by the free world, if they are quick, if they are sufficient, will mean that millions of our people who became forced migrants because of this war will be able to return home.
Japan and the UK have agreed a landmark defence deal as the two countries address ways to put pressure on Russia. During a meeting in London today, Boris Johnson and Fumio Kishida have said the pact will allow forces to deploy together to carry out joint exercises and humanitarian relief. Japan also announced a wave of new sanctions against the Kremlin. It comes as Mr Kishida's first official visit to the UK was marked with an RAF flypast. And Buckingham Palace says the Queen will miss the annual Royal Garden Party season. The monarch will instead be represented by other members of the royal family. Her Majesty has some mobility issues and has missed a number of engagements this year, but she continues to carry out virtual appearances and other duties instead. You're with GB News, more news as it happens. Now it's time for Brazier.
Six minutes past 5. There's been a further twist in developments surrounding the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Earlier this week, we reported that investigators claim to have uncovered new evidence leading to some suggestions that fibres from the missing girl's pyjamas might have been found in the main suspect's van. Hopes were raised of an evidential breakthrough after German lead prosecutor Hans-Christian Wolters gave his interview to Portuguese TV. Wolters has now clarified those comments, saying, quote, "We have found no fibres, and I can tell you the new evidence we have is not forensic evidence." Well, Christian Bruckner, 45, a convicted rapist, was named by Portuguese police as the prime suspect in the toddler's disappearance. What does this latest development tell us about the progress of the case? We've been talking about it for so long, haven't we? Former Scotland Yard detective Peter Blexley, I'm delighted to say, is here in the studio. I wonder if this was misreported, over-reported, this idea that there really seemed to be a concrete link with this suspect?
Well, yet again, hopes have been raised and probably dashed for many, many people who are so desperate to see some kind of resolution to Madeleine's disappearance. But my irritation rests mainly with Mr. Wolters, the German prosecutor, because in recent times he's said words to the effect of, "We've got our man," but we haven't got the evidence. Now, I think he's fundamentally failing to grasp the nettle here, in that any pragmatic detective will tell you there's one thing knowing something, and it's a completely different thing trying to prove it.
Do you think there might be an element here? We've got the police forces of three nations involved: UK, Portuguese, Germans. And they've all got different evidential bars, they've all got different criminal justice systems, but they're also potentially trying to say, we can crack this case, this internationally infamous case, we can crack it.
Yes, and Walters has been saying that. He's almost saying it's cut and dried, but we don't have the evidence, which is frankly ludicrous. If he were, for example, in the UK and was working for the Crown prosecution system under our justice system, and a prosecutor said words to that effect, then a very smart defence lawyer would stand up at a trial and the very first thing he would say is, my defendant cannot receive a fair trial, because of these comments that Mr. Walters has been saying. Now, I'm no expert on the German criminal justice system, but in any event, this is unwise, it's given rise to speculation, and it may have raised the hopes of many, many people.
Cathy Gingell, we're talking about this week a lot because it's the 15th anniversary of her disappearance. And we've been reflecting not just on the investigation, how it's going, wrong turns, things that have got wrong, how much evidence has been brought together, but also just the impact at the time on people, and why this touched nerves that no case almost in living memory touched.
Well, it's sort of horrific. I think it's lived with people. I mean, I remember just being on holiday recently with my then not 2-year-old grandchild on Swanage Beach down in Dorset, and I was just terrified all of the time that she'd run out of my sight or out of my sight. Everything changed after Madeleine McCann, in a way, really, didn't it? There can't have been one parent who didn't have that sort of guilty feeling. Goodness, if I hadn't left my child for that number of minutes, if I hadn't done this, all things that we, in a way, possibly used to take for granted, we could. But after that, there was a sort of programme change somehow. And I have to say, I looked at the papers today and I saw the picture and I thought, oh God, those poor bloody parents. I mean, I cannot imagine what it must be like, this having happened to you and not knowing and not knowing and not knowing. It's grim. And I almost wish the papers hadn't done it. I almost wished it. That's selfish. Well, it hadn't been there.
The news is oftentimes pretty grim, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, that's a large part of the business we're in.
Yeah.
And I say that in this context of the story we're about to deal with. And Peter Blexley has agreed to offer us some comment on it while he's here with his expertise. And that is that the mother of Baby P could be freed from prison, potentially within weeks. This has been revealed within the last few hours. Tracy Connolly, whose child died after months of abuse, will be released from prison, it's believed, after the parole board rejected a government challenge against its ruling. Connolly was released on licence in 2013, but was recalled to prison 2 years later for breaching her parole conditions. Peter, this became one of those, I was going to say cause celeb. I mean, it was a sort of celebrated case, but that sort of suggests it was anything other than hideous, which it clearly was a hideous crime. The mother became the person people looked to, but actually the boyfriend was the killer. She merely let this horrible torture and eventual killing of Baby P take place. Where do you stand on the idea of politicians saying to the parole board, who look really carefully at all the sentencing guidelines and all the evidence of whether somebody poses a future risk to members of the public, are you happy with politicians like Dominic Raab today saying, bad call this by the parole board?
It's not only the Justice Secretary that's annoyed by this decision. In the short few hours since this was announced, I've been speaking to people who share revulsion, and they're very angry that she's going to be released for the second time, of course, because she breached her parole conditions once before and was recalled to prison. For some people, certain criminals are never deserving of a second chance. I'm not in that camp, although some people are beyond the pale and are beyond rehabilitation and should spend their entire lives in prison. The parole board in recent times has not covered itself in glory, because you may recall the release of Colin Pitchfork, an absolutely astonishingly perverse decision. A man convicted of rape and murdering 2 girls in separate events. Pitchfork was released, there was an outcry, and lo and behold, he very soon breached his parole conditions.
Peter Blexley, as ever, thanks for coming in. Now, America has provided Ukraine with intelligence that has helped to kill Russian generals. This is according to a report, the New York Times, no less, claims to have spoken with anonymous senior American officials who confirmed that many of the dozen Russian generals killed by Ukrainian forces had been specifically targeted with the help of American intelligence. The US National Security Council denied that America had intentionally helped Ukraine to target and kill those generals. However, American officials reportedly said that the Ukrainians combined US intelligence with their own information to conduct the lethal attacks. Let's turn to an Associate Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, Taras Kuzio, who joins us now. Taras Kuzio, welcome to you. Appreciate your time. The way the American response comes through on this is as if they're saying, yes, we've provided some information, but it wasn't as detailed as could then allow the Ukrainians to assassinate somebody. What's your reading of it?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, in the final analysis, it's the Ukrainians themselves who have to actually build on that intelligence, find out where these senior Russian officers are located, and then use special forces to attack them and kill them. I mean, the American part of the entire equation is only really the beginning of it, and this is not that new of information. I mean, the Americans have been very good at listening into Russian political and military traffic, going all the way through till last year. I mean, if we remember, the Americans were telling us in advance what the Russians were up to even prior to the invasion. Yeah. So they've obviously got some very good listening posts somewhere inside Russia.
Yeah, and incredibly localised. I mean, it's one thing to maybe eavesdrop electronically on discussions about strategy, but to actually identify with a reasonable degree of accuracy where a given individual might be on a battlefield space, that's something else.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the Russian army is configured in a different way to Western armies. I mean, the Americans lost only one general in 20 years in Afghanistan. The Russians have lost 12 in just over 2 months of fighting in Ukraine. And the Russian army is heavily dominated. You know, it has a lot more generals than a typical Western army. Let's remember that. Russian army doesn't have as many of the sort of middle-ranking officers as we would have in a Western army. And because the war hasn't been going very well for Vladimir Putin, he's been pressurizing the top brass, the generals, to get out of their comfort zone, as it were, and go up to the front line. And that inevitably makes them easy target. And that's what it seems has happened. I mean, they've gone up to the front line, as it were, and therefore have been killed.
Yeah, you wonder if it's almost a bit like World War I, when actually the rates of attrition amongst the officer class in the trenches was higher, wasn't it, than the ranks, because they had to set an example and lead them over the top. Taras Kuzio, thanks so much for joining us today. We've got to crack on, but thanks for your time. Thanks a lot. The American actress Amber Heard yesterday in court tearfully described the first time Johnny Depp allegedly slapped her. It was the first time Heard has spoken in the ongoing multi-million-dollar defamation case. Heard is today giving evidence again on day 15 of the trial. Up until now, the Court of Public Opinion has seemingly been behind Depp, especially amongst young people, especially on social media. The question now, perhaps, is whether Heard's testimony will begin to turn that tide. Joining me from Los Angeles is Paul Dudridge, host of the Politics People podcast. Paul, welcome to you. It's been a real feature of this case. I've not been following it closely, but I have picked up conversations around my own dining table, teenagers following it and following it firmly in the Depp camp, to my surprise.
That's right. And right up until yesterday, basically. Look, it's terrible that we're even talking about this, but it's just gossip now, isn't it? It's great. But I will stick my neck out at this point and say I do not think Johnny and Amber are going to be getting back together. So I'm prepared to stake my reputation on that. But yeah, up until yesterday, everybody was Team Johnny. And now, after a day and a half of tearless sobbing from Amber, I'm on the fence now. It's she did pretty well there's a lot of body language experts coming out and saying that no, there was nothing behind it. She's not sincere. But I don't know. I think she was pretty effective on the stand yesterday. The stories, you know, these kind of stories ring true when they're very, very prosaic and very basic and very mundane. And the slap, which we can't make light of, the first time that she claims that she was struck by Johnny Depp came after her making fun of his Winona Forever, because he'd previously dated Winona Ryder. He'd had his Winona Forever tattoo. Instead of having it removed completely, he had it changed to Wino Forever. And she'd laughed at that. And for that, she received his physical lashings out. And so it is sounding very, very plausible, I have to say. What's really fascinating is that, as in all stories these days, J.K. Rowling's involved. It's all happening on a boat that J.K. Rowling bought off him. This was all the yacht that Johnny Depp owned. He was about to sell to J.K. Rowling, so they took one final trip on it. So she's everywhere.
I read one of the tattoos had been modified to go slim. Is it slim to scum to scam? I mean, that's clearly a theme running through this trial. You're right to make. I mean, we need probably to be a little bit po-faced about this, don't we? Necessarily, we are talking about allegations of domestic abuse. They are serious. That's a given. I just wonder, as we looked, you probably didn't see them, Paul, but we were looking. And apologies for our listeners on radio. At some of the footage from inside court. Is this now ranking as one of those courtroom dramas? Up there with, well, I remember sort of the infamous Louise Woodward trial, but even some of the ones that followed all the way through to Michael Jackson. Is it, dare I use the phrase, is it box office on that scale in the States?
Very much so. Very much so. It's pushed all other news off the front page. And considering, we've just had the leak of the Roe v. Wade announcement, the very fact that this is actually going toe-to-toe with something as monumental as that story gives an idea of the gravity that it's being treated with here. And again, we've talked about this, we've touched on this previously. It's to do with the fact that this stuff is available. They must have, 20 years ago, these people wouldn't have gone to court for this. But now, this is just another part of their entertainment portfolio. So it's actually a valid performance from both of them for no matter what the content is. The fact is we are talking about it. They are taking up headlines. You don't sort of judge fame anymore. You weigh it and, they are front page. Yes, it's a huge story over here.
Paul Duddridge brings a healthy dose of scepticism to Hollywood. Paul, thanks very much indeed. As ever, Cathy Gingell is alongside me. One thing we didn't mention there with Paul, there was this extraordinary petition. 3 million people, I think, signed it, saying...
Johnny Depp one.
Well, that Amber Heard shouldn't be
in the blockbuster.
booked.
Yeah, honestly, I haven't been following it. I'm not like all the Americans. I just can't read it. I can't follow it. I can't bear it. I can't... bear the performance sort of look, the fact that it has become a soap opera. It is a soap opera, and yet it's meant to be real. But I do know that the Johnny Depp thing, it's been going on 2 years. This was before lockdown. I can't quite work out where we are.
Well, I tell you what, ponder on this, because, you created a popular website called The Conservative Woman. I observe, I've talked to my teenage daughters about this, and they're very right on. And you'd expect them to be very much down with Team Amber Heard, victim of domestic abuse. I would totally get that. They're not,
Well,
they're not.
I did write a blog on this when this all happened before lockdown in February, and just looked back and I thought I've forgotten. And actually, my blog said, is there about to be a He Too movement? That was my blog, because everyone was coming out pro-Johnny then, and he was portraying himself as the victim. I really, really daren't say anything because I can't remember anything much accurate about it. But I think at that point she'd been accused, or he was accusing her of violence. But I never know what's sub judice and what's not and what we can't say. I really don't want to get into things. But it was very interesting that there has been a turnaround to say it's not just women who are the victims. And if women are going to play that game, maybe men will play the victim game too.
Well, maybe it happened. Cathy, thanks very much indeed. Coming up on today's show, the civil servants who tried to block Britain's Brexit benefits, according to the outgoing Australian ambassador. First, a break.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Britain's flagship trade deal with Australia was almost derailed by anti-Brexit civil servants, according to the former ambassador to London from Australia. George Brandis, the, in fact, not ambassador, ex-High Commissioner, added that Whitehall's horror over leaving the EU led to some UK negotiators displaying reluctance, which bordered, he says, on hostility. He said the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which represents British farmers, was the most obstructive. Joining me now is Ben Habib, businessman and former MEP. Ben, welcome to you. It will come as no surprise to any farmers who might be watching or listening that DEFRA was particularly obstructive. They've got a reputation, rightly or wrongly, for not really understanding the world in which they work, namely agriculture, but more broadly the civil service. More broadly the civil service trying to dig in their heels when it came to negotiations. We could imagine this happened, but evidence, there's the thing.
Yeah, well, DEFRA is squarely in the dock on Brexit. I'm going to digress slightly. DEFRA is the body responsible for effectively signing over our fishing waters to the European Union, which is such a key component of getting Brexit done, taking back control of our waters. But actually, it's DEFRA that has overseen the giving away of rights in perpetuity. Don't let anyone mislead you. The reality is that we have given up substantial portions of our waters in perpetuity under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement for as long as that agreement stays in place. So DEFRA should be hugely criticised in its role over Brexit. And it doesn't surprise me at all that they tried to derail this Australian deal. For them, us pivoting towards, if you like, our historic cultural Commonwealth trading partners is a pivot away from the European Union. And as you rightly said, Colin, our civil service is absolutely in love, for reasons which are beyond me, but absolutely in love with the European Union.
What do you say, Ben Habib, to those people listening, watching, who'll say, oh, come on, guys. I mean, civil servants do what they're told under our constitutional settlement. If deals were made that made permanent trading relationships with our nearest neighbours, then that's a ministerial fault. There are elected officials who run these departments, and if they're not running them properly, don't blame civil servants.
And I would absolutely agree with you. And I think one of the flip side of this coin is 12 years of Conservative Party government that has failed to get a grip of its civil service. David Cameron was famous for blaming the EU for everything that was wrong in British politics. When we couldn't blame the EU, we now blame the civil service. And whilst blame undoubtedly resides with the civil service, as far as we are concerned, the electorate, blame has to lie with the government, because it's the government we elect to take charge of the civil service and to make sure it functions in the way that we wish it to function, along the lines of party manifestos that were, promises made in party manifestos. So absolutely, Colin, you're right. It's not sufficient for the government. I don't think it was the government in this case with the ambassador to Australia, but it's not sufficient for the government to point at the civil service and say, well, they're blocking our ability to get things done. It is government's job to govern the civil service. And after 12 years of Conservative Party government, they should have got a grip of it. And the other thing I just want to mention, it's a slight sidetrack, Colin, but it's real. I think your listeners will be interested to hear this. When the parliamentary candidates for the Conservative Party were put forward back in 2019 for the general election, the Brexit Party, of which I was a member then, did an analysis of all the complexion of the Tory prospective candidates, and 130 odd of the 350 odd who were returned to Parliament voted Remain. So actually, it's not just the civil service that is against Brexit. You've got a very strong Remain contingent within government, and it is part of the problem with getting Brexit done, which, as you might know, Colin, I don't think Boris Johnson has achieved yet.
I just wonder whether, if that's all true, and I've no reason to think it isn't, whether that anti-Brexit mindset is demonstrative of something else. And I'm thinking in particular of reports, I've no idea whether they're true, feel like they might be, of what's been happening in the Home Office recently, where you've got a Home Secretary who's trying to drag, kicking and screaming, a Department of State, one of the biggest, into dealing with a problem as intractable as illegal migration to the UK, Rwanda, etc. And you're getting senior mandarins quoted as saying, we're not going along with it. Now, that strikes me as much more corrosive in our trust in our constitutional settlement.
And again, I completely agree. I have real feeling for Priti Patel trying to get this illegal migration problem resolved. Her best idea to date, which was pretty much her original idea, was to turn boats back as they tried to enter British waters. But that was defeated by the civil service and by human rights lawyers. And by the way, we've signed into the European Convention of Human Rights by treaty under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So we're committed to it. Our ability to deviate and to do as we wish as a country, as far as the protection of our borders from these migrants seeking to come across the North Sea is concerned, is limited as a result of that trade agreement. But I have huge feeling for Priti Patel. No doubt she is trying her best, but she is up against a government that isn't wholly in favour of Brexit. She's up against a civil service that is against it. And there's almost a kind of self-loathing in British society. There's a sort of guilt thing going on, which makes, I think, Priti Patel's job much, much more difficult, because there's a desire, there's this kind of belief that we're responsible for the creation of all these migrants being abused in their home countries, and that we should welcome them with open arms and so on. And people are not putting the United Kingdom first, and that includes, as I say, not just the civil service, but members of government.
Ben Habib, as ever, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Kathy Gingell alongside me for thoughts on that one.
Well, Ben Habib nailed it on each one. He's absolutely right. Remainer, Whitehall, Remainer civil service, a large part of the Conservative Party Remainer, and actually all acting...
No, not the party, the MPs.
The Conservative Parliamentary Party, yes. Basically acting quite subversively, arguably. I think there's another aspect to it. I think we've got a generation of politicians who don't dare have the intellectual or experience confidence to challenge civil servants.
Or if you're Priti Patel, you do challenge them, they get called a bully.
And I think, yes, exactly, so you get turned on and demonised. I think that's certainly the case. I think there's another side of it, and it's the long march through the institutions of lefty progressivism, progressive, not very progressivism, and I think the civil service is captured by that. And they're very young. I was called in to some briefing about drugs policy a few months ago at Dominic Raab's Ministry of Justice. I couldn't believe the age of the 23 to me. Well, they probably were older than that, as you've pointed out earlier. I am old, but they look
never did that.
Sort of. They look very young and inexperienced, and therefore straight out of university with woke ideas, and somehow this woke full sense of compassion, as Ben Habib says, colours everything that people think they ought to say and do. And so we're up against the whole thing.
Kathy Ginchel, hitting her stride, I think we'll all agree there. Thanks very much. I've never called you old.
No, we're not quite, by implication, around in the early Cold War.
Blimey. We're going to have a conversation during the commercial break. And after the break, the number of flying insects in Great Britain has plunged by almost 60% since 2004. How has this affected the UK's environment? First, the latest news headlines.
Colin, thank you. Good afternoon. The Bank of England has today raised interest rates for the fourth time in a row from 0.75% to 1%. That's the highest level since 2009. The Monetary Policy Committee is trying to calm inflation, which it forecasts will peak at over 10% this year. The banks also warn the economy is set to shrink next year by 0.25%. The World Health Organization says 15 million people have died globally from COVID-19 or as an indirect result of the pandemic. The number is 3 times higher than the official tally. The UN body believes many countries undercounted the number of people who died, with only 5.4 million initially recorded. Here, the mother of baby P could be released from prison within weeks after the parole board rejected a government challenge to keep her in jail for longer. Tracy Connolly was convicted in 2009 for causing or allowing the death of her 17-month-old son. The Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, described Connolly as pure evil and said the justice system needed an overhaul. The Prime Minister took his dog Dylan with him as he cast his vote for the local elections this morning. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, also voted alongside his wife, and the Lib Dem Ed Davey was seen visiting his local polling station as well. Voters are choosing local representatives in England, Scotland and Wales. There'll also be an election for the Northern Ireland Assembly. Those are the headlines on TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. You're with GB News, and Brazier is back in just a moment.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's 2 questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, but to the point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
It's coming up to 22.6. Now, the number of flying insects in Great Britain has plunged by almost 60% since 2004. This is according to a survey that counted splats on car registration plates. Inelegant language, but you know what we mean. The scientists behind the survey said the drop was terrifying, as life on Earth depends on insects. The results from thousands of journeys by members of the public in the summer of 2021. It was compared with results from 2004. The fall recorded most highest in England, 65%, Wales, 55%, and fewer insects recorded as being splatted in Scotland, 28% there. Let's turn to Paul Hetherington, Director of Fundraising and Communications at BugLife, who joins us now. Paul, hi to you. Thanks for your time. Why the discrepancies between the home nations, do you think?
I think it's probably about the sort of habitats you have in those areas. Most of England tends to be fairly intensive agriculture or urban areas, whereas when you get up into Scotland, you've got a lot of very sort of barren, open space, you know, the moorlands and so forth. So I just think they've got a lot more wild space left up there.
How accurate a scientific indicator are splats on number plates?
Well, as long as you've got enough of these records coming in, it's a very good indicator, and there aren't any other really empirical measures that are going on in the UK. And we've had researchers come in from other countries that have similar sort of effects to this. We had the survey a couple of years ago came out of Germany, where they were looking at falling nature reserves, and you had 77% since the 1970s. So it's kind of on a par with that, possibly slightly worse when you consider it's in such a short period of time. But yes, as long as you've got enough records coming in, we had over 5,000, you're able to get significant results. Unfortunately, we didn't get enough results from Northern Ireland to be able to give a figure for there.
OK. And we know, don't we? I mean, Mother Nature works in such a way that the knee bone is always connected to the hip bone, and if there's an impact on insect life, that has an impact elsewhere. What's the manifestation of that? Is it things like pollinators and therefore there's been an impact on plant life? Is it more the fact that the insects aren't there, therefore they're not being eaten by the next species up the food chain?
It's really all of those. I mean, the impact on humans and our food chain will be massive if we were to lose them. If we lost just pollinators, you're looking at putting £2 billion per annum onto the cost of food in the UK, and that's paying someone a minimum wage to go around and hand pollinate things. And that's the kind of job that we struggle to fill as well, to be honest. On top of that, you've got things like the dung beetle. The dung beetle's worth over £250 million per annum to UK farmers. You add all of that up, and you know we're worried about the cost of inflation, the way prices are going up now. Imagine how prices would go up if we didn't have insects, if we had to replace them. So that's the impact on humans. Also, massive impact on birds and small mammals, all of the things that we love to see out there in nature. They're right near the bottom of the food chain, and without them, just about everything would disappear. 8 out of 10 of our wildflowers, 1 in every 3 mouthfuls that we eat. The impact is absolutely massive. It's the kind of thing we don't notice, though. Like, I guess bugs, invertebrates are a bit like, you know, perhaps the secretaries and the admin teams and the finance team in a big business, and you know they don't sell anything, they don't make anything, is what you might say. But if you took them away, the whole business would fall down, and that's kind of where we are with bugs. We tend to not notice what they're doing. We don't give them awards or plaudits, but if they were gone, we would miss them.
They're unglamorous, they're uncuddly, they're not furry, pretty animals and pets. But as you say, we'd miss them if they were gone. I mean, it's always that slightly difficult question. I hesitate to ask it, really, whether individuals can do anything to make a difference.
Yes, we can all do something. I mean, the great thing about bugs is that you can, in a very small area, create unique and really good habitat for them. If you want to save the tiger, you've really got to sort of donate and deliver huge acres of junglescape or whatever is required for the sort of the large fauna. But for something like bugs, you can do something. Even if you don't have a garden, to be honest, if you put a window box on your flat and you plant some of the right plants, and I always say if it's literally all you can do is a window box, put herbs in there, because if you let them flower, they're food for pollinators. Okay, you've not created a huge amount of habitat, but you've created perhaps the equivalent of a motorway service station, if you like, where pollinators can pop by, grab a bite to eat, refuel themselves in the way we'd refuel a car at a service station, and move on to the next place where they can really live. And that's helping to put connectivity back. So we can all do something, and if we all did something together, lots of small steps add up to one big result.
Paul Hetherington from Bugs Life, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it. Kathy Gingell's alongside me. I planted a hedge recently. I've got a little paddock where I live. I planted a hedge, and you see the life that uses those corridors. It's you can really see the difference.
Yeah, I'm sure that what he says, we all should be doing this. And I think about my fly swatter, and perhaps I better live with the flies that buzz around the kitchen.
Well, I wouldn't give you a fly swatter. You'd use it on some of the other guests.
I know. So, but actually, there's a bigger step we could take. You're aware that wind turbines have had this devastating effect on bat and bird populations, and it's interesting that they can be attracted to those areas. Well, I did a little bit of research before coming on, and this is a 2021 study that the annual loss of insect biomass at wind turbines estimated for Germany was equated to about 1.2 trillion insects killed per year. A single turbine located in a temperate zone might kill 40 million insects a year. So if we really should think very carefully about this expansion of wind turbines from this environmental point of view. This assumption that they're environmentally friendly, they're horrifying with bats and horrifying with birds. And I hadn't realised the absolute same principle applies with insects. Somebody's going to ring up and say, who's she saying all this stuff? But that's what I read, and anyway, we should consider it and find out about it, really.
I'm sure the people who make the wind farms will say it's worth... we get more good out of them than we take out.
But poor insects. Well, and bats and birds.
Yeah, OK. I'll get you a fly swatter. Now, the fully electric plane, it's to be designed and built entirely in Britain, has made its maiden flight. It's the single-seat Sherwood E-Cub. Took to the skies above Norfolk last month, relying solely on a battery to power the takeoff. It was developed at Cranfield University in Bedfordshire. The plane made an initial 10-minute-long flight, followed by a second 22-minute-long flight from Little Snoring Airfield in Norfolk. Dr. Guy Grattan is a test pilot and Associate Professor of Aviation at the university. He piloted the aircraft and said that it was, quote, one of the most exciting things that he'd ever done. Delighted to say that this might be the second most exciting thing he's ever done, live on GB News. Dr. Grattan, thanks for your time. How important?
Very important, because it's necessary if we're moving into this next stage of aviation where we can create low emissions aircraft, that we crack an understanding of how to fly aircraft that don't use conventional fuels, and how to build, test, certify these aircraft here in the UK. So this is the whole point of this project, with UK funders, university, multiple companies, is building up this body of knowledge here so that this can then be shared going forward onto multiple other projects.
And apologies, as usual, to our listeners on radio, but we're looking at some pictures of the takeoff. And it's looking like a fairly old-fashioned plane, really. And I was expecting lots of composite materials and very long wings and all that sort of stuff you see with aircraft that use the power of the sun, for instance. But you've got that old problem between having enough power to create the lift needed to take off versus the fact you've presumably got a pretty heavy battery there that's going to make that aircraft stay as close to Earth as possible.
Yes, I mean the actual aeroplane, it's a current design. The the manufacturer, TLAC, the light aircraft company in Norfolk, still build them and sell them. But we picked it because it's actually a very easy aircraft to modify. And when you're trying to do this sort of flying research where you're fitting stuff that's not been in an aeroplane before, you have to modify the aircraft. It actually is a lot better for that purpose than something made, for example, out of carbon fibre. Later on, doubtless, there will be much more modern-looking aeroplanes using the lessons we've learned off this.
I'm guessing, Guy, in a sense, this is, in terms of how this progresses, it's more a story of battery development than it is of the avionics.
Yes. I mean, the batteries are vastly better than they were 10 or 20 years ago. They've only just got good enough to do this. But to put this in perspective, this aeroplane will probably fly for to an hour and a half. And of this, it's a 300 kilogram aeroplane. 78 kilograms of that is me, and another 78 kilograms of that is the batteries. We may well find that actually batteries are a bit of a dead end for anything other than training and sport aircraft, and we're starting to get into hybrid configurations, fuels like hydrogen. But all of those are actually still going to require what's basically an electric aeroplane. So the technology we're developing here, I think, is going to be necessary whatever the next direction is, even if the next direction isn't a pure battery electric.
And, I mean, obviously, we think of the airlines and how they're keen, understandably, to establish their environmental credentials. I mean, we're looking at a prop aircraft here. I mean, where's the research, what direction's the research going on when it comes to jet flight?
Well, for jet aircraft, there's two real options there. One is to use sustainable fuels, and that's difficult because there isn't necessarily enough feedstuff there in terms of agricultural byproduct and waste or pure energy crops in order to produce enough biofuels. Plus, they're not completely environmentally neutral anyway. There may well be, if we can generate enough electricity to do it, a possibility to pull CO2 straight out of the air and turn it back into jet fuel. So that's a possibility. But equally, I think the future may well involve a lot more propellers than we're used to seeing at the moment. Because a propeller airliner, perhaps in the smaller size, the 20 to 50 seaters, can be much more efficient for the shorter trips, city pairs like London, Edinburgh. So I think we are going to see more propellers in the future, but equally, no, this isn't going to get you to Los Angeles. That's going to have to require something like biofuels, or maybe a hydrogen-powered jet aircraft, which is certainly possible, but it's going to need a lot of research yet.
Guy, I've got to leave it there. Guy Grattan, really appreciate your time today. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
It looks like Prince Harry, having told the world how important his support is to the Queen, is now expected to miss her Platinum Jubilee. It's reported that the Duke of Sussex will instead be in California for a polo competition. The Queen's grandson recently gave a widely criticised interview, some comments in which he said the sovereign needed his protection and his help in ensuring the right people were around her. Angela Levin's come in today. This is lovely, the two of you here. I'm very pleased. Yeah. We haven't seen you for a bit. It's nice to come in.
Yeah, I haven't seen you for a long time, yes.
He's up to his old tricks, it would appear.
Yes, he's obviously got he's plotting one step after the other of trying to bring the monarchy down.
Wow, that's a claim.
It is a claim, but what else is he trying to do? He's trying to destroy it. He says his brother and his father are trapped. He's absolutely must be upsetting the Queen. He pretends he wants to look after her, but he's not there when he wants to. And if you haven't seen someone for 2 years who's 96 and has not been very well, you don't turn up for about 10, 15 minutes, do you? Because it's more painful afterwards. There's not a proper chat. He did the same with his father. He went in deliberately late because Prince Charles and Camilla had to do the dowries that the Queen couldn't do. So he couldn't sort of postpone anything because it was very important with former soldiers. And It's all some sort of nasty game, I think. It's plotting, it's a sort of chess.
If it is a game, there's a misstep in the game here, in the sense that they're normally the two, the Sussexes, very conscious of their image, and they're on the side, they want to see themselves, it seems to me, on the side of modernity, you know, down with the kids, all the rest of it. So Polo doesn't fit into that, does it?
Well, this is another sign of hypocrisy, because he said very recently that he wants to bring up his children to know about equality, that all of us in this lovely world will all be equal. There he is, playing a posh man's game and going on posh man's
There's nothing wrong with that, you know.
There's nothing wrong with that, but you can't say I'm just an ordinary man like everybody else is, because he's not. And he's abusing his position. Although he's not a working royal, he still has the title. And he is just going ahead with it because he knows they can't answer back or won't, or too dignified to answer back. And also, it must be a game that this the Jubilee has been planned for ages. He's still making up his mind whether he might be able to fit it in. I mean, it's impolite, isn't it, in the extreme? You can say, I don't think I can come, I really can't make it. But the thing is that if the Queen is unlikely to go on the Buckingham Palace balcony, I think we don't want Prince Harry there, and we don't want Prince Andrew there, because it looks wrong. I mean, I'm a huge monarchist, but I don't want to see them there in place of the Queen because she can't manage it. And I think that maybe he feels that he doesn't want to be at the back. He doesn't, you know, all this pushing forward and pushing in line. I just think it's such a disappointment, because he was such a nice man when I met him.
But the same could be said about Prince Andrew. Back, you know, we're reflecting on the 40th anniversary of the Falklands War, aren't we? Kathy Kingel's here. This is the royal family. That's got great strengths, hasn't it? But because they're a family, these are individuals who you can ask them to do something. You could ask Harry to keep out of the picture. You could ask Andrew to keep out of the picture for the good of the monarchy. They don't have to obey you.
No, I wanted to go back. I interviewed Angela and read her book about her conversations with Prince Harry, and it is fascinating. It's not exactly Prince Andrew, is it? The way you described your conversations with him that you had how many years ago now? He had a lot of charm. He had, you say...
But 2018, that's right. It's very kind of you. Thank you. Yes, he seemed to have a sort of the same stardust that Princess Diana, his mother, had, and he was very intuitive about people, and he was absolutely brilliant with people who'd been damaged either physically or emotionally. He, in 2 minutes or 3 minutes, you think he was trained to do it. And though several of them said to me afterwards, when he'd moved on, that they've given him a reason to live. But he's lost all that. It's all gone. And it's just nastiness and spitefulness. And I don't believe he doesn't understand how the Queen feels by him not being there. This is a most amazing Jubilee, isn't it? We're never going to see anything like it in our lifetime. She wants the family there, no matter what they've done. And he's going to play polo. We don't know it's 100% sure, but we think that it's in the 90%.
He's absolutely blown it. It's such a shame.
Is it Meghan? Can I ask that?
Well, you can, but you'll have to carry on the conversation when we're off air, because we've got about 7 seconds
you
left.
were reluctant.
And off they go.
Sorry.
Off they go. It's so lovely having the two of you in the studio.
No,
it's a real
I'll
treat.
be quiet.
Thank you very much indeed. Much more news coming up. Michelle Dewberry is next.
Book Angela again.
Here she is. Michelle Dewberry next.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. It's turned into a fine spring day for southern parts of the UK, but cloudier skies have plagued the north, and there'll be outbreaks of rain, increasingly so overnight and into the start of Friday. These weather fronts are toppling in over an area of high pressure. They've been lurking close to the northwest of Scotland through the day, hence the cloudier and, in places, damp weather. But increasingly they'll spill south overnight, so for western Scotland by midnight, spells of rain, heavy and persistent at times, and then during the early hours that rain pushing into Northern Ireland and much of the rest of Scotland. Increasingly cloudy too for northern and western England, as well as Wales, some mistiness around coasts, but clear spells holding on in central and eastern parts of the country. A few fog patches possible first thing, temperatures down to around 8 degrees in London. But bright enough as we start off Friday. We'll keep the sunny spells for East Anglia and the southeast throughout the day. Brightening up as well following a damp start for Scotland and Northern Ireland. 1 or 2 showers following, a fresher breeze for the far northwest, but otherwise plenty of fine weather to end